Tail 47. This is General Ransom. Approach 442 as directed. Acknowledge. She said nothing. 3 Black Hawks limped back to base at dawn, every pilot down, poisoned in their own cockpits. 380 soldiers trapped in a valley, a storm closing in, 5 hours left. There was no one to fly them out. Except her, a 24-year-old maintenance contractor, nobody had ever let near a cockpit. She carried 1,400 hidden flight hours, and a father's voice she'd spent 4 years learning to hear. 9 extractions. Rocket trails streaking past her windshield, a landing blind in a wall of dust, and on the final run coordinates leading straight into an ambush, ordered by a general who'd killed her father to bury the truth. She turned the radio down, not off, and flew home anyway. Outpost Thorn sat at the edge of a valley that did not care what happened inside its walls. The mountains did not care. The wind did not care. The fluorescent light in Hangar 4, the one that had been flickering every 40 seconds for 6 weeks, definitely did not care. Harlow Nash had counted the flickers so many times she no longer needed to count. Her body did it for her now. A small twitch behind her eyes. 40 seconds. Flicker. 40 seconds. Flicker. Like a heartbeat that belonged to the building instead of to her. It was 300. Which meant it was not morning yet. Which meant nobody else was awake to see her on her knees on the concrete, elbow deep in an avionics panel, penlight clenched between her teeth like a soldier holding a knife in a trench. Because that's what this was. A kind of trench. Except her enemy wasn't visible. Her enemy was a fault code. Intermittent. Cowardly. The kind that vanished the second anyone important walked close enough to see it. 6 days. 6 days of senior technicians shaking their heads. 6 days of somebody writing cause unknown on a clipboard and moving on to easier problems. Which was fine. Which was expected. Because nobody expected the intern to find what the senior guys couldn't. Nobody expected the intern to look this hard either. Harlow was 24 years old. A junior at the State University's aeronautical program, though everyone on this base called her the freshman, not because they were confused about her year. Because freshman was a word you used on someone who hadn't earned the right to be called anything else yet. She had stopped minding the word. Or she had gotten very good at pretending not to mind it. The line between those two things had blurred somewhere around week 3, and she had not had the spare hour it would take to sort it back out. The cold came up through the concrete in waves, timed almost as reliably as the flicker overhead. Kansas winters had prepared her for a lot of things. Not this. Not a chill that didn't just sit on your skin, but climbed in through your kneecaps and set up residence in the bone underneath. She'd layered a thermal shirt under her contractor's vest that morning, and it hadn't been enough, and it still wasn't enough, and she was fairly sure nothing short of body heat from another human being would have been enough, and there wasn't one of those available at 300 in a hangar nobody wanted to be in. Her fingers found the connector. Position P14, main avionics bus. Clean housing, no corrosion. Nothing that would ever show up on a walk-around. But underneath, a hairline fracture in the copper. Invisible unless you already knew exactly where to look, which meant invisible to everyone, except a person who had spent 3 weeks deciding where to look, and 3 mornings on her knees actually looking. She sat back on her heels, let out a breath long enough to fog the cold air in front of her face. Found you. There was a photograph in the chest pocket of her vest. There was always a photograph in the chest pocket of her vest. She didn't take it out. She didn't need to. She knew it the way she knew this cockpit, not because she'd tried to memorize it, but because she'd looked at it so many times, it had simply become part of the architecture of her mind. Her father, standing beside a helicopter not so different from this one. Flight suit. A grin that showed up in every photo she had of him, the grin of a man who'd just gotten away with something, and was fairly sure no one had noticed yet. Marcus Nash, Ridgeback Aviation Wing. He'd been 34 when he died. 4 years ago. A mission that was supposed to be routine. An insertion. The kind of flight that ended in a debrief and a beer, not a folded flag. Official cause, enemy contact. Official letter, 3 paragraphs, her name misspelled in the second one. She had been 20, middle of a structural mechanics exam. A counselor knocking on the door. and she had known before she stood up, before anyone said a word, the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes color. She remembered the drive home from campus that day more clearly than she remembered most of the funeral. Her aunt behind the wheel, because nobody trusted Harlow to drive herself, and outside the window the flat Kansas fields going by in long gray smears, and inside the car nobody saying anything at all, because there wasn't anything to say that wouldn't have sounded small next to what had actually. Her mother had been the one who told her the details. Weeks later, in pieces, the way you hand someone something too heavy to give them all at once. Mission compromised. Enemy contact near the insertion point. No survivors from the lead aircraft. A letter with her name spelled Harlow in the second paragraph, which was such a small, stupid thing to fixate on. And yet she had fixated on it anyway, because it was easier to be angry about a typo than about everything else the letter didn't say. She put the panel cover back on. Torqued every screw to spec, not by feel, by tool. Because feeling was not a calibration standard, and spec was spec, and some things in this world had to stay exactly, precisely correct, or nothing else would hold together either. She stood, slow. Her knees had been arguing with the concrete for 2 hours, and the concrete was winning. She looked at the aircraft the way you look at something you love when you think no one's watching. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't supposed to be pretty. Scratched fuselage, faded paint over older faded paint, a dent near the tail rotor housing that somebody had patched years ago and never bothered to repaint properly. But nothing about it was wasted, and everything about it had a reason, and that to Harlow was its own kind of beauty, the only kind that mattered. She'd been flying since she was 16. Never military. Never allowed that far, not officially. Civilian hours, taught by her father's oldest friend, a retired aviator named Walt Greer, who kept a small plane and a grass runway on his property back in Montana. He'd put her in the left seat the summer after her father died. The summer she was furious and grieving, and had nowhere to put either one. Your dad wanted you to know this feeling, he'd said. So let's start. She remembered that first flight better than she remembered most of that whole summer, the grass strip cutting a pale line through Walt's back 40, the smell of hot avgas and cut hay, her hands shaking so badly on the yoke that Walt had to reach over twice and steady them without saying anything about it. She remembered crying somewhere over the second turn, not from fear, from something else entirely, something that didn't have a clean name, and Walt hadn't said a word about that either. He'd just let her cry and fly at the same time, like the two things were allowed to happen together, like nobody had ever told him they weren't. Feel it, he'd said later, once her hands had steadied and her eyes had dried on their own. Don't fight it. It already knows what it wants to do. Your job is to understand what it knows. She hadn't understood, not that first summer. She'd understood it the way you understand a phrase in a foreign language, recognizing the shape of it, without yet knowing what it meant underneath. It had taken years for the meaning to arrive. It had arrived slowly, the way most important things did, a little more with every flight, until one day it wasn't a phrase anymore. It was just true. 8 years, 1,400 hours, none of which existed in the official record at Outpost Thorn because 6 weeks ago, during in-processing, a warrant officer had glanced at her civilian flight log and said those hours weren't relevant to her role here, and moved on to the next line of the form. She remembered that moment with a clarity that still, 6 weeks later, made something tighten low in her stomach. The warrant officer hadn't even looked up while he said it, hadn't asked a follow-up question, hadn't seemed curious, even slightly, about a 24-year-old contractor who'd logged more rotary wing hours than some of the pilots currently flying out of this base. He'd just crossed a line off a form, the way you'd cross a grocery item you'd decided you didn't actually need, and moved on. She hadn't argued. She hadn't yet understood that this wasn't an oversight, that it had a name she didn't know yet. She turned off the penlight, picked up her tool bag, walked out of the hangar into a Wren Hollow dawn that hadn't decided yet whether it was going to be beautiful or brutal. Sometimes it was both. The mess hall at 430 was mostly empty, mostly quiet, mostly populated by the specific category of person who was either just starting a shift or had just finished one and hadn't yet worked up the energy to go be a person somewhere else. Harlow fell into the second category most mornings, though tonight she suspected she looked more like the first, because Petty Officer Ray Cassin, the only other soul awake at this hour, with any regularity took one look at her and slid a cup of coffee across the counter without being asked. "Fixed it," she said. Not a question. A statement disguised as one, the way most things Cassin said came out. "Fixed it," Harlow confirmed. 6 days those two clowns spent poking at that AFCS, Cassin said, meaning the two senior technicians who'd given up on the fault before Harlow ever laid a finger on it. "You found it in 3 weeks working nights. Nobody assigned you." "Nobody assigned me the days either," Harlow said. "I just kept showing up." Cassin gave her a look that was half admiration and half something closer to worry, the look of someone watching another person run themselves too hard towards something that might not thank them for it. "You know they're never gonna say, thank you for this, right? Whoever signs off on that fix, it's not gonna be your name on the paperwork." "I know. Doesn't bother you." Harlow wrapped both hands around the coffee cup, letting the warmth finally reach fingers that had spent 2 hours getting slowly colder against a concrete floor. "It bothered me the first week," she said. "Now it's just Tuesday." Cassin snorted, which from him counted as genuine laughter. "You're a strange one, Nash, I've been told." She drank her coffee slow, watching gray light start to seep in around the edges of the mess hall's plywood-framed windows, and thought not for the first time about how strange it was that a place this far from home could start to feel, in its own limited way, like a routine, like a life. She had a coffee guy. She had a hangar bay that felt more like hers than the barracks bunk she was technically assigned. She had a fluorescent light with a flicker she'd learned to predict better than she'd ever learned to predict anything about her actual future. She had 6 weeks left on this rotation, and then she'd go back to campus, back to lecture halls and problem sets, back to a version of her life that suddenly felt smaller than it had before she left for it. She didn't let herself think too hard about that. There wasn't time. There was never quite enough time, on this base, to think all the way through to the end of a thought before something else demanded her attention instead. By 540 she was back in the hangar, running the final diagnostic on the AFCS panel she'd spent 3 weeks chasing. Green lights down the line, every indicator steady. The kind of clean readout that made all 6 days of failed troubleshooting before her feel, in retrospect, almost forgivable. She packed her tools, stood, looked at the aircraft one more time, tail number 47, the Black Hawk she'd unofficially adopted as hers over 6 weeks of maintenance work. Nobody else wanted to do carefully enough to actually finish. She didn't know yet that in 3 hours she'd be sitting in its left seat, with her hands on its controls instead of its wiring. Nobody knows the exact shape of the day that's about to happen to them. That's usually the mercy of it. And sometimes, she would think much later, it's also the cruelty. She walked out of the hangar into pale early light, the kind that hadn't yet decided what kind of day it was going to become, and headed toward the barracks for 2 hours of sleep she fully intended to take, and would, in the end, never get. The call came at 609. Not an alarm. Not technically. Just a sound 3 aircraft on approach, which happened every day, which should have meant nothing, except the approach wasn't right. Harlow heard it from just outside the mess hall, where she'd stopped to refill her coffee before heading to bed, a decision that, in hindsight, felt almost providential, because it put her within sight of the flight line at exactly the moment everything on it went wrong. Something in the pitch, something in the rhythm of the rotors. Not mechanical. The engine sounded fine. The rotor systems were turning at normal RPM. It was something in the hands. The way a car drifts before the driver consciously notices they've drifted. She was already moving when the first one hit the ground. Not a crash. Not exactly. More like the aircraft simply stopped believing in the landing and put itself down wherever it happened to be. 40 feet left of centerline. Skids gouging dirt. The whole airframe yawing hard before it stopped, like the pilot had tried to correct, and the correction hadn't come from anywhere useful. Like the signal left the brain and arrived somewhere else entirely. The second aircraft skidded in behind it, spun 90 degrees, sat there, nose toward the mountains, like it was done with the whole enterprise. The third made it all the way to the ground clean, and then the pilot just stopped. Harlow ran. She was not supposed to run toward a flight line emergency. She was not medical. She was not security. She had no business here whatsoever. She ran anyway, because her legs had made a decision before the rest of her caught up to argue with them. This isn't your job, the frantic part of her brain said, even as her boots hit pavement, even as the distance to the third aircraft collapsed under her. You fix wiring. You don't run into an active flight line incident. What are you even planning to do when you get there? Harlow, what's the plan? There wasn't a plan, there was just running. She reached the third aircraft as Sergeant Torrin Blake wrenched the pilot's door open. Griffin Aldraty, 51, senior aviator at Outpost Thorn. She'd seen him every day for 6 weeks. He had spoken to her exactly 4 times. 3 of those times had been move. He wasn't moving now. His hands sat in his lap, his head tilted back. His eyes were open and focused on absolutely nothing inside that cockpit. His right arm shook, not panic shaking, something rhythmic, controlled, like his nervous system was sending a signal his muscles could no longer receive. Aldraty Blake, loud, can you hear me? The tremor did not stop. Harlow looked at the other 2 aircraft, medics pulling pilots from cockpits. Colonel Vance Whitlock coming out of the operations building still zipping his flight suit, already shouting questions nobody had answers for yet. 6 pilots. 5 unconscious or unresponsive. Griffin technically awake. Technically. Not functional. Not today. Maybe not this week. She stepped back, looked at the flight line. 3 aircraft sitting crooked on the dirt. Fuel trucks at the perimeter, hoses still connected from the pre-dawn fueling cycle. And 1 truck, parked slightly off the pattern she'd memorized over 6 weeks of watching this exact ground crew work. Not dramatically off. Just enough. Look closer. Something in her said, quiet and insistent, the same instinct that had spent 3 weeks staring at a wiring diagram until it revealed a fracture nobody else had found. Something's wrong here beyond the obvious. Look closer. She walked to it, crouched at the coupling where the hose met the fuel port. The fitting looked standard. The hose looked standard. But in the gap between fitting and housing a residue, thin, almost colorless, the kind of thing that looked like condensation, looked like nothing. She didn't touch it. She stood, looked at the sky, which had finally, fully, committed to morning. Pale, cold, indifferent. This wasn't mechanical failure. This wasn't pilot error. Something cold settled low in her stomach and did not move. She thought about the 6 weeks she'd spent memorizing every inch of this flight line, every hosen, every fitting, every standard placement of every piece of ground equipment, thought about how easy it would have been to miss this if she hadn't spent that much time noticing patterns nobody else had bothered to notice. And then she thought, uncomfortably, about how easy it would be for whoever did this to keep doing it, if nobody else here had spent 6 weeks the way she had. That thought did not make her feel better. It made her feel, distinctly, like a person who had just become responsible for something she hadn't asked to be responsible for. Griffin was sitting up on the second cot when she found him. He shouldn't have been sitting up. He'd been unresponsive 12 minutes ago. But he was a man who'd spent 30 years doing things he shouldn't do, and he clearly wasn't tired of it yet. He looked at her the way people look at something they hadn't expected, and were taking a beat to categorize. "You're Marcus Nash's kid," he said. Not a question, a landing. The verbal version of setting something down carefully because it might break. She stopped 2 feet from the cot. You knew him. Flew 19 into 20, right seat to his left, mostly. He looked at his own hand, made a fist. Slow, deliberate, let it go. Before Wren Hollow, I never talked to anyone who was there. There were reports. There was a letter. There was the specific kind of silence my mother keeps on some subjects. My mother, he'd said. She corrected the thought before it could fully form. No, not his mother, hers. She'd misheard. Or maybe she hadn't. Maybe he'd meant it, the way people sometimes misspoke around grief, borrowing a phrase that belonged to someone else because the real one was too close to say out loud. She sat. He talked about you, Griffin said, carried a photo. You in the left seat of a Cessna. Your grandfather's hat swallowing your whole head. She knew the photo. Said you felt an aircraft in a way he'd never seen in someone that young. Said you had better instincts than he did. A pause with weight in it. Said he was going to teach you himself. When he got back, the fluorescent light in the aid station buzzed. No flicker. Just a flat, constant sound. He didn't get back, Griffin said. Silence your file, he said finally. When you came through in processing, someone flagged it before you arrived. Told the warrant officer your civilian hours weren't to appear anywhere. Not logged. Not visible. Her stomach tightened. So it wasn't an oversight, she thought. I knew it wasn't an oversight. I just didn't want to be right about it. Someone made sure you'd come here, Griffin said, and nobody would know you could fly. She looked at him. Who? Above my pay grade, Griffin said. Genuinely. But there's something unresolved from your father's last mission. Something that never made it into any official report. Something people are still protecting. He reached into the side pocket of his flight bag on the equipment table, pulled out a folded piece of paper. Small, not official, creases worn soft from years of being carried, her name on the outside, her father's handwriting. Leaning forward in a hurry, the way he always wrote. He gave me this before Wren Hollow, Griffin said. Told me find her when she's ready. She took it. It was warm. Warm from a body that had carried it for 4 years. She didn't open it. Not yet. She put it in her chest pocket, next to the photograph, and felt both of them there against her sternum, and did not let herself think about what that weight meant, or she was not going to be able to do whatever came next. How long have you been carrying that? She said, and her voice came out smaller than she wanted it to. 4 years, Griffin said. Waited for the right moment. There's never actually a right moment for something like this. I decided this morning was as close as I was going to get. Why now? He looked at her, steady, tired, the tremor in his arm finally settling into something barely visible. Because in about 10 minutes, he said, someone is going to walk into that operations building and ask who can fly, and I have a feeling it's going to be you. And I thought you should have that in your pocket before you climbed into a cockpit today. Whatever happens next. She sat with that for a moment. The weight of the letter against her chest felt suddenly less like paper and more like something with mass, something with gravity of its own, pulling at the center of her. I can sit in your right seat, Griffin said. I can run checklists, talk you through anything airframe specific you haven't seen. My arm's not going to cooperate for anything else. He looked at her, steady. You can do this. You don't know that. Your father told me, Griffin said. And your father was right about everything. He put his feet on the floor. Slow. Let's go find out if he was right about you too. The operations center smelled like burnt coffee and decisions nobody wanted to make. Harlow heard it before she reached the door. A satellite radio, crackling with a voice trying very hard to sound calm while everything around it stopped being calm by the second. She stood outside. Plywood walls. Sandbags. An air conditioner that had surrendered days ago. She listened. 380 personnel Marine and Special Operations elements pinned in Wren Hollow since 300. 18 wounded. 4 critical. A sandstorm rolling in from the west. 5 hours. Maybe less. They needed extraction. They needed it now. And Outpost Thorn hadn't pilots. Harlow did the math without being asked to. 2 down hard. 3 unconscious with no recovery timeline. 1 with a tremor that made a control stick a liability, not an asset. 0 pilots. Inside, Colonel Whitlock stood over the radio, voice flat in a way that wasn't natural. The kind of flat that got built, layer by layer, across a career of being the person responsible when everything went wrong. I need an honest assessment, Colonel, the voice on the radio said. Not the one you want to give me. We have no available pilots, sir. A silence with a shape to it. Say that again. All aviators at this installation are medically non-operational. 380 personnel in a valley with no cover, the voice said. 4 men who need surgery in the next few hours. A weather window closing in 5. Tell me you have something, Colonel. Anything. Harlow stood at the door for one more second, hand not yet on the frame, and let herself feel fully, to keep completely, for the space of a single breath, how terrified she actually was. Not of the flying, of the room, of walking into a place where every instinct in her had learned, over 6 weeks, that she was not welcome, and saying the one thing guaranteed to make that unwelcome feeling worse before it got better, if it got better at all. You don't have to do this, said the small, frightened, entirely reasonable part of her mind. Nobody's forcing you. You could turn around right now, and nobody would ever know you. Almost 380 people, said the other part. The part that had spent 8 years in the left seat of a small plane over Montana, learning what her hands already knew before her mind caught up to it. You're not turning around. She walked through the door. Every head turned. She could feel the room doing the same math simultaneously. Wrong person, wrong room, wrong moment. Nash Whitlock's voice, low, controlled. Get out of my, I can fly them out, she said. Silence. The specific silence of a room trying to decide whether to be angry or to laugh, and landing on neither, because something in her voice made both feel wrong. You're a student contractor, Whitlock said, like she might have forgotten. You maintain avionics. You do not fly aircraft off this base. 1,400 civilian hours, she said. Rotary and fixed wing. I know this airframe. I've spent 6 weeks inside every system on this flight line. I fixed the AFCS fault on tail 47 this morning at 541. She'll fly clean. He stared at her. Get out, the voice on the radio cut in. Who is that? A contractor, sir. Let her talk. Whitlock's jaw tightened. A muscle moved in his cheek. He looked at the radio, looked at Harlow, and the look he gave her, she would remember it later. It wasn't cruelty. It was something closer to fear. The fear of a man being handed an outcome he couldn't control and finding no way out of it. I can do this, Harlow said, to the room, to the radio, to whoever needed to hear it. Right now I am what you have. And right now what you have is enough. 6 seconds passed. She counted. Colonel Whitlock, the voice said. Get her in the air. Whitlock set the handset down slowly, like it had gotten heavier in the last 30 seconds. He looked at Harlow for a long moment, and something in his expression shifted, not warmth, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The look of a man recalibrating an assumption he'd been carrying for 6 weeks, without examining it once. If you're wrong about this, he said quietly, about any of it, the aircraft, your hours, your ability to fly a combat extraction under fire, people die. You understand that? I understand that, Harlow said. I also understand what happens if nobody flies at all. He held her eyes a moment longer, then turned toward the staff officers behind him and started issuing instructions in the clipped, rapid cadence of a man who had, whether he liked it or not, just made his decision. Odette Bono was standing in the hangar doorway when Harlow crossed the flight line. 58 years old. Gray-streaked hair pulled back tight, the face of a woman who laughed often and was not laughing now. She stood with her arms crossed, not blocking the door, just present in it, watching Whitlock try one more time to talk himself out of what was already decided. She goes down in that valley, Griffin said. The same number of people die as if nobody went. She's 24, Whitlock said. She's the only one standing. Whitlock looked at Harlow. If something happens to you, then something happens to me, she said. But right now nothing is happening to 380 people except that they're running out of time. He turned away. Not consent, not enthusiasm, but not refusal either. Odette stepped out of the doorway, looked at Harlow, not through her, at her. Your father's name will carry you to that cockpit, she said quietly. After that, it's just you. How do you know about my father? Because Griffin has been talking about Marcus Nash's daughter since the day he got here. A pause. And because I think he came here specifically because you were going to be. Harlow filed that under later. When there was a later. She thought, briefly, of all the things that had happened in the last hour that she hadn't had time to fully absorb. A poisoning, a hidden letter, a warrant officer who'd erased her flight hours on purpose, a colonel who'd just handed her the controls of a combat aircraft, because there was, quite literally, no one else left to fly it. She thought that somewhere underneath all of it, if she let herself look too closely, there was a version of this morning that terrified her far more than any of the individual pieces did. She didn't look too closely. There wasn't time. She walked toward the aircraft. Tail number 47. Opened the pilot's door. Climbed in. The seat, the harness. Cyclic. Collective. Her hands went where they needed to go without being told. Because she'd studied this cockpit in diagrams and manuals and three-dimensional imagination for 6 years, and the reality of it was exactly where she expected everything to be. Griffin climbed in on the right. "Engine start," he said. "Engine start," she said back. Battery, generators, turbines catching. That rising whine climbing into a note she felt in her sternum before she heard it in her ears. Rotor blades beginning to turn overhead. Slow. Then faster. Then a sound like continuous thunder, the kind you stop hearing after a while, because it stops being a sound within the world and becomes the world itself. She put her hand on the cyclic, felt the vibration, the aliveness of a machine under power. Don't control it, Walt had told her. The first summer, her hand shaking slightly on the yoke of his little plane over Montana. Don't try to control it, Harlow. Feel it, it already knows what it wants to do. Your job is to understand what it knows. She'd been 16, furious, grief hollowed, and the sky had been the only place large enough to hold all of it. She was 24 now. The sky was the same size it had always been, and she was, if anything, less afraid of it. "Ready to lift," she said. "You don't need my permission," Griffin said. He was watching the instruments, right arm resting useless in his lap. She looked through the windshield. The flight line, the wire fence, the mountains, the pale morning sky, with 5 hours and some change left in it before the storm made all of this academic. She pulled the collective. The aircraft changed. Not suddenly. Gradually. Weight shifting off the landing gear onto the rotor disc, skids lifting a fraction of an inch. Then more. Then the ground was below her instead of under her, and that distinction mattered more than it ever had in her life. Outpost Thorn dropped away. The mountains opened around her, enormous, indifferent. She pushed the nose forward. The aircraft accelerated. Below her, the base shrank to a cluster of brown rectangles in a brown valley, and then smaller, and then she was in the sky, and she was flying, and 380 people 90-something miles to the southwest did not yet know her name. "Thorn Tail 47 is airborne," she said. "En route to Wren Hollow. 380 souls awaiting extraction, static." Then Whitlock, dry as the dust below. 47, copy. "Good luck." She didn't answer that, she flew. 93 miles in a straight line at altitude would have been nothing. A cup of coffee and a view. This was not, that morning, nap of the earth. The technique aviators like her father had spent decades refining into something closer to art than aviation. You didn't fly over the terrain. You flew with it. Followed the contours, the way water follows a gradient, using low ground for cover, becoming, for a few minutes, part of the landscape, fast and loud and temporary, but part of it, 140 knots, 200 feet above the ground. At that speed, the world outside the windscreen moved like film running too fast. Brown rock, the white trace of a dry riverbed, a road unpaved, empty, a compound with one lit window, and someone inside it, just beginning their morning, with no idea what was passing over their roof. "Canyon entry at your 1 o'clock, Griffin said. 12 miles out. You'll lose GPS precision inside you're on the paper map from there." "I know the approach," she said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, steadier than she felt, because underneath the steadiness, there was a small, frantic voice. "What if you're wrong? What if 6 years of studying a cockpit in your bedroom doesn't translate to this? What if no? No, stop. Fly the aircraft. Fly the aircraft. That's the only thing you can control right now. So control that and let everything else be later's problem." She put her eyes back on the terrain. "He was right about you," Griffin said quietly. She didn't answer that either. Not because she didn't hear it, because there wasn't a place inside her right now with room to hold what it meant. Not while she also needed room for airspeed and altitude and the growing, gnawing awareness that somewhere behind them, less than 5 hours out, a wall of weather was already deciding how this day was going to end. She banked hard left. Canyon walls rose on both sides, red rock, ancient, the low morning light throwing shadows that made the passage look narrower than it actually was. She tracked the left wall by feel and by distance markers she'd already memorized. Not calculating, knowing, she thought, briefly and involuntarily, of every hour in Walt's little plane that had built toward this exact kind of knowing every summer, every lesson, every quiet correction from a man who'd loved her father enough to spend 8 years teaching his daughter what her father never got the chance to teach her himself. She thought that if Walt could see her now, he probably wouldn't say much. He'd probably just nod, the way he used to after a good landing, and let the moment be exactly as large as it actually was without trying to make it larger with words. The canyon opened. Wren Hollow spread below her in the first flat light of morning. Wide, brown, a river reduced to a gray thread at the bottom of it, and on the far side of a dry riverbed small figures, not moving the way civilians move, moving the way people move when every position is a choice. 380 of them, or close to it. I have visual, she said into the radio. Show me smoke. Green smoke rose from the position below. I see you, she said, and began her descent into a valley that had already decided, 4 years ago, to take something from her family and hadn't finished yet. The valley didn't wait for her to be ready. Valleys never did. Harlow brought the tail 4-7 down through the last 100 feet, with her hands steadier than her heart, and somewhere behind that steadiness, a voice kept trying to interrupt her. This is real. This is actually real. You are actually doing this. And she kept shoving the voice into a drawer and slamming it shut, because there wasn't room for it. Not right now. Not with 50 feet of clearance on either side, and green smoke curling up into her rotor wash and 18 wounded men waiting on the ground below her, like something out of a nightmare she'd never let herself finish imagining. The skids kissed dirt. She didn't shut the engines down. You never shut the engines down on a hot LZ. You touched, you loaded, you lifted, you cycled back. An aircraft sitting still on open ground was a target, and every second of rotor spins with the skids planted was a second somebody with a rocket launcher was doing math she did not want them to finish. The cargo door slid open behind her. She heard it more than saw it, the change in air pressure, the sudden rush of noise, men shouting instructions she couldn't make out over the turbine whine, boots on metal, the particular grunt of someone lifting someone else's full weight because that someone else couldn't lift it themselves anymore. Litters first, Griffin said beside her, right arm still useless in his lap, left hand steady on the instrument panel, like it was the only part of him that still worked exactly the way it was supposed to. Too critical. Watch your torque. You're going to feel the weight shift the second they're aboard. I feel it, she said. And she did. She felt the aircraft settle half an inch on its skids as the first stretcher came through the door. Felt the whole airframe recalibrate itself around a new weight it hadn't been carrying 30 seconds ago. And something in her chest unclenched just slightly because the aircraft was still listening to her, still hers, still doing what she asked it to do. 13 aboard, Griffin said. Sometime later, though later might have been 90 seconds or might have been 9 minutes, because time did something strange on a hot LZ. It didn't move forward so much as it accumulated, stacking on top of itself in overlapping fragments a face, a hand on a stretcher rail, a young man with dust caked into the creases of his neck, looking at her through the open door, with an expression she didn't have time to read and would think about later anyway. 2 litters secured, ready to lift. Lifting, she said, and pulled the collective, and the ground fell away, and Wren Hollow shrank beneath her into something that looked almost peaceful from 300 feet, which was the particular cruelty of altitude. From up here you could pretend it was quiet down there. From up here you could pretend a lot of things. She didn't pretend, she flew. The second run went faster than the first, because she knew the terrain now. Not knew it the way she'd known it from studying maps in a plywood operations building. For 6 weeks knew it the way you know a hallway in the dark. After you've walked it once already, feet finding the turns before your eyes confirm them. The third run, an RPG came off the eastern ridge. She saw the smoke trail before she processed what it was, a thin white line drawing itself across the pale morning air toward the exact place her aircraft currently occupied, and her hands moved before the rest of her caught up to give them permission. Left pedal, cyclic right, the nose dropped. The whole airframe skidded sideways through the air like something alive and frightened, and the warhead passed through the space she'd been sitting in a half-second earlier, close enough that the wake turbulence shuddered through the fuselage and rattled her teeth. Griffin's left hand was white-knuckled on the doorframe. "That was, I know," she said. She was already re-establishing the approach. Lower this time, different angle. If they wanted to shoot at her, she was going to give them less to shoot at, and that was simple math. And simple math was the only thing keeping the frantic voice in the back of her skull from climbing out of its drawer and taking the controls itself. "You almost died," the voice said. "You almost died and you didn't even scream." "Later," she told it. "Fly now, scream later. There's a schedule for this." She put the aircraft down on the fourth run with 50 feet of clearance and didn't think about the RPG again until she was climbing out with another 13 souls aboard, and her hands had finally started to shake, small, contained, invisible to anyone who wasn't watching for it. She was watching for it. She let it happen for exactly 4 seconds and then made it stop, because a shaking hand on a cyclic was a decision she couldn't afford to make twice in one morning. Between the fourth run and the fifth, on the return leg, with the valley behind her and 90 miles of open sky ahead, Griffin reached into the flight bag at his feet and came up with a folded sheet of paper, different from the note in her chest pocket. This one was printed, official-looking, with an encrypted header stripped down to plain text by someone who'd had the clearance and the reason to do it. He held it where she could see it without taking her eyes fully off the instruments. "What is that?" she said. Not really a question. More like she was buying herself. 2 seconds before she had to know. "Something I've been sitting on," Griffin said. "Something I should have told you before you ever got in this aircraft. Except there wasn't time, and now there's still not much time. But there's some, and I'd rather you hear it from me than find it some other way." She glanced at the paper. Read what she could in fragments between scanning her instruments, and what she read made the valley below her seem suddenly less like a rescue and more like a continuation of something that had started a long time before this morning. The 380 personnel pinned in Wren Hollow weren't on a standard patrol. They were protecting one person, a witness, someone with direct knowledge of intelligence packages that had been altered years earlier. Altered in ways that sent people into situations that were known, at the time, to be compromised. "How long have you known this?" she said. "Suspected. For 4 years." Griffin's jaw was tight. "This is the first confirmation I've had." She flew. The valley came back into view below, green smoke rising, waiting for her the way it had been waiting all morning, and somewhere underneath the smoke was an answer to a question she'd been asking since she was 20 years old, and sitting in the middle of a structural mechanics exam with no idea her entire life was about to reorganize itself around 3 paragraphs and a misspelled name. "Does Whitlock know what's in that message?" she said. "Whitlock didn't send it," Griffin said. "Whitlock doesn't have the clearance to send it. Somebody above him does." She adjusted for a crosswind she hadn't been expecting and didn't let herself think about the word above for longer than it took to file it away. The 5th run was the one that put Odette Bono in her cabin. Harlow hadn't asked why. There was a version of why she already understood and a version she didn't, and neither version changed what she needed to do in the next 4 minutes. So she said nothing when Odette climbed aboard with a medical kit slung over one shoulder and a face that had already decided to be calm no matter what came through that cargo door next. In the back, a man with no visible unit patch and a hand-lettered set of numbers on his shoulder pocket was bleeding from a wound high on his left side. Every breath cost him something you could see: a catch, a hitch. The particular effort of a body working hard for something that should have been automatic. He was conscious. That was the thing that mattered. He was conscious, and he was not looking at the ceilings the way badly wounded men sometimes look when they're negotiating privately with their own bodies about whether to keep going. He was looking at the cockpit, at the back of Harlow's head, at the set of her shoulders, at the small continuous adjustments of a pilot who wasn't fighting the aircraft but talking to it. "What's your name?" Odette asked him, quiet, working an IV line into his arm with hands that didn't shake, even though the cabin was. "Holloway," he said. "Ezra Holloway. Stay with me, Ezra, I'm right here." His eyes moved back to the cockpit. "Who's flying?" "Harlow Nash." He went still. Not the stillness of pain. The stillness of a name landing somewhere it had been waiting to land for a very long time. "Nash," he said. Not a question. A word set down carefully. The way you set down something you've been carrying so long, you've forgotten it has weight until you finally put it somewhere. "That's right," Odette said. He watched the cockpit a moment longer. "She flies like somebody who was taught by the same hands," he said. Odette waited. "I was there," Ezra said. 4 years ago. The mission that took Marcus Nash. I was ground element, not aviation. I was in the back of a helicopter in the dark, and he was in the left seat, and he talked about his daughter the whole way in. A breath, careful, costly. Said she had better instincts than him. Said he'd made sure of it. Odette's hand went still on the IV line for exactly 1 second before she made it move again. "I've been trying to find her for 4 years, Ezra said. "Not today," Odette told him, gently. "The way you tell someone something true and difficult in the same sentence. Today she's flying." "No," he agreed, closing his eyes. "Not today." He opened them once more, found the back of Harlow's head through the gap between the seats, and something in his face settled, like a door closing on something that had been open too long. "I just needed to see her fly," he said, and let Odette finish her work. The 4th landing zone was the one Harlow had been dreading since she'd studied the map that morning, because she'd known the way you know weather. Before it arrives that this one was going to test something in her that the first 3 hadn't. A natural bowl hemmed on 3 sides by rock. No clean approach. A tailwind the forecast had promised would sit between 8 and 12 knots, and which the actual atmosphere had apparently decided should wander wherever it wanted, no warning given. And the dust. Brownout happened when a rotor disc got close enough to loose sediment that the downwash went outward along the ground and curled back up underneath the aircraft, dragging a cloud up with it self-generated, growing from nothing to everything in about 4 seconds, swallowing every visual reference a pilot had. No horizon, no ground, no walls of the bowl to orient against, just brown rotating through brown, and the sound of 10,000 grains of sand, a second hitting the windscreen like static made physical. You didn't fight brownout. You transitioned to instruments the instant the dust came up, and you flew those instruments like they were the only real things left in the world, because in brownout, they were. "Approaching threshold," she said. "Expect brownout inside 50 feet, Copy, Griffin said. "I have the VSI. Call your rate. 400 down, 3. The cloud took her. Everything gone. All at once. Valley walls, ground, horizon, sky reduced to a single indistinguishable brown, and the only things left in the entire universe were the numbers glowing on her instrument panel and the fever of a machine talking to her through her own hands. Altimeter, 38 feet 35. VSI, 300 feet per minute. Holding torque steady, RPM in the green. The frantic voice tried to climb out of its drawer again. "You can't see anything. You can't see the ground. What if the ground isn't where the instruments say it is? What if—" "Shut up," she told it. "The instruments don't lie. The instruments have never lied to me once today. Trust them." She felt the ground before she saw it. That was the only way she'd ever be able to describe it later, to anyone who asked, which nobody would, because nobody who hadn't sat exactly where she was sitting would ever really understand what she meant. a change in the acoustic signature of her own rotor noise, the reflected sound bouncing back up off a surface close below, subtly different from open air. Detectable only if you'd flown enough brownouts to learn to hear it. The aircraft wanted to settle. She let it settle. The skids touched, brown everywhere. The low vibration of 3 tons of helicopter confirming, slowly, that the ground beneath it was in fact ground. She held the collective a fraction above the stop, ready to lift the instant anything about the situation demanded it. On the ground, she said. Confirmed, Griffin said, and then he didn't say anything else for a moment, and then, quietly, Harlow. That was remarkable. She didn't answer. She was still flying the aircraft, even though the aircraft was on the ground, because, in brownout, on a compromised LZ, you were still flying until the moment you absolutely weren't. The dust settled in slow layers. The valley reassembled itself, piece by piece, through the windscreen rock walls. Brown sky, the floor of the bowl, and standing at the edge of her rotor clearance, waiting for the visibility to return before he'd risk approaching, was a man she hadn't met yet, but would come to know by voice alone for most of this day. He walked to her window. Not the cargo door, the pilot's door. He looked at her the way people look at something they're revising an opinion about in real time. He didn't say anything. He gave her a single small nod, the kind that costs something, because it comes from someone who doesn't give them freely, and turned to start directing his people toward the aircraft. She looked forward again. Don't control it, she heard, and this time it wasn't Walt's voice in her memory. It was her father's, reconstructed from stories and photographs, and the particular shape of an absence she'd spent 4 years learning to live around. Don't control it. Feel it. Trust it. It already knows the way home. She hadn't known those were his words specifically. She'd only ever known them as Walt's. But Walt had gotten them from somewhere. She understood now, finally, from whom. By the 6th run, the storm was no longer a threat on the horizon. It had become a presence, a brown wall, that had defined itself out of the vague western haze into something with dimension, something taller than the mountains it was slowly absorbing, moving with the patience of a thing that already knew it was going to arrive, and felt no need to hurry. She ran the numbers between approaches. Not on paper. In her head, the way she'd been running them since the first run. 380 extracted so far, 130-some remaining. Roughly 12 to 13 per run, the range she'd been consistently hitting. 10 more cycles needed, at 22 minutes round-trip minimum, not counting LZ time or weather deviation. The weather window was closing in just over 2 hours. The math did not work. The math had not worked since the 3rd run, and she had been flying anyway, because the math not working was not a reason to stop flying. It was a reason to change the math. The northern route, she said. Griffin looked up from the instrument scan he'd been maintaining one-handed. We've been avoiding it. Cliff face on final approach, 200 feet, vertical, no go-around option if you misjudge it. It saves 9 minutes a cycle, she said. 9 minutes times 10 remaining runs. 90 minutes. That changes everything. He was quiet for a beat. The storm moved. She moved. If you misread the wind on that face, he said, there's no second chance. I know. No recovery if you're wrong. I know, Griffin. He looked at her a long moment. The valley floor below, the storm behind them both, patient, certain of itself. I'm going to use it, she said. He nodded once. I'll call the turns, he said. You don't need to. I know, he said. I will anyway. At the outpost, Odette Bono was standing in a lab doorway reading a fuel analysis that had come back 30 minutes earlier than she'd expected, which told her something about how urgently someone else had wanted it found. Synthetic organophosphate. Not standard issue. Custom synthesis. Absorbed through normal respiratory exposure during a routine fueling cycle. Odorless. Invisible. Producing no symptoms at all until blood concentration crossed a threshold, at which point the entire nervous system began failing in a specific timed cascade. Tremor. Loss of voluntary motor control. Unconsciousness. Time to hit everyone exposed at roughly the same moment. The access logs showed one name attached to the fueling area outside his normal duty assignment. A logistics specialist with 11 years of service and a record too clean to be anything other than managed. Odette folded the pages, put them in her pocket, walked out into the gray afternoon light and made 2 phone calls. The first was to a contact in Washington she'd known for over 2 decades. 2 rings. "I need you to run a name for me," she said, "and I need you to look at the authorization chain on an operation from 4 years back. Wren Hollow." A pause on the other end. "Call you back in 20. The second call was to Whitlock. She read him the compound classification, the timestamps, the 2 names that mattered. She didn't editorialize. She read. When she finished, there was a silence on the line with a particular quality, the silence of a man who has just understood something he can no longer pretend not to know. "Where is he now?" Whitlock said. "Motor pool. As far as anyone can confirm. He won't be there long," Whitlock said. And he wasn't. Ezra Holloway was not supposed to be sitting up. The medic had told him twice, in unhurried, clinical language, that the correct posture for a man with a penetrating chest wound and significant blood loss was unconscious. Certainly not upright. Certainly not repeatedly asking questions about the pilot. He was sitting up anyway, asking questions anyway. "She's still flying," the medic told him for the 3rd time. "How many more runs?" "I don't know. 3 maybe. 2? He looked at the ceiling. 4 years. 4 years since Wren Hollow the first time. 2 deployments. A medical discharge for an injury that had nothing to do with this one. A re-enlistment that took 18 months of favors called in from every corner of a 12-year career. All of it aimed at exactly one thing, getting himself back to a country he had no particular desire to return to, because he needed to finish something he'd started in the dark 4 years ago and hadn't been able to close since. He reached under the edge of the cot. His plate carrier had been cut off him, standard procedure, with a chest wound. You didn't waste time undoing straps, but the small zippered interior pocket, the one he'd sewn himself with materials from a base exchange years earlier, had been handed to him without comment the moment the medic noticed him feeling for it. Inside, a flight badge, stamped alloy, a crest, a serial number, a name along the lower edge, small enough that you had to already know it was there to read it without squinting. Emiya Nash. He'd found it in the wreckage 6 feet from where Marcus Nash had fallen 4 years ago. Intact, unscratched, as if something with better judgment than the situation had set it there deliberately. He'd put it in his pocket, thinking he'd find the family quickly. Return it, the way you return things. Simple obligation. It had not been simple. The door opened. Odette, face set the way faces set when someone confirms a suspicion they'd hoped was wrong. "Tell me what you know," she said. He told her. When he finished, she told him what she knew, and when she finished, he reached into the gear bag the medics hadn't cut off and pulled out a small thumb drive. "There's a colonel in the Inspector General's office," he said, "and a staffer running a parallel inquiry through the Armed Services Committee. Her card's in the front pocket of that bag." He paused, weighing what he said next carefully. "This goes outside the normal chain. That's not negotiable. Anything that runs through the usual channels runs through rooms where certain people still have friends." Odette took the drive. "And Harlow, she doesn't need this today," he said. "Today she's flying. Careful. But she deserves the truth about her father. The real version, not the letter." He looked at the ceiling again. "I'll tell her myself. When she's on the ground. When she's had 5 minutes to be a person instead of a pilot." Odette held the drive in her palm. Outside, the wind had picked up the storm's leading edge, feeling ahead of itself through the high window. The light going gray and strange. The mountains disappearing into brown, drifting in from the west. And under all of it, faint at first, then not faint at all, the sound of rotors. Coming back. The northern route, the first time through, put her 50 feet high, because the canyon's acoustics behaved differently than she'd calculated, and she corrected mid-approach in a way that cost 11 seconds. She immediately filed away as a mistake. She wasn't going to make twice. The second pass she was clean. The third pass she was fast. 9 minutes saved per cycle. The math was changing, the way she'd told Griffin it would, and somewhere underneath the satisfaction of that, there was a small, exhausted part of her that just wanted to put the aircraft down somewhere quiet and stop being the only thing standing between 300 people and a closing weather window. She didn't listen to that part. Not yet. There'd be time for that part later. Between the 6th and 7th runs, a new voice came over the radio, the same one that had been coordinating ground positions all day. Calm in the specific way. Calm gets constructed rather than felt, built out of training, and the decision to be useful instead of afraid. Tail 47, you've made 8 approaches to this position today. Copy, she said. That's more than most pilots make in an entire deployment. It's been a long morning, she said. A pause. Copy that. Something in his voice that wasn't quite warmth, but lived in the neighborhood of it, the neighborhood where professional respect settles before it becomes anything else. Be advised, 61 personnel remaining at this position. Security element is 12. 2 more lifts closes it out. I have them, she said. Tail 47. A slight pause, understood. On the 8th run, Griffin was quiet through the first half of the approach, and then, without preamble, he said, your father used to talk about what made the difference between pilots who were technically proficient and pilots who were. He stopped, searching for the word, different. She checked her instruments, kept her eyes on the approach. He said the difference was whether you loved it, Griffin said. Not the job, not the mission, the actual flying. Whether you loved the aircraft the way it needed to be loved unconditionally, including when it's hard, including when it's telling you things you don't want to hear. He paused. He said he'd only met 3 or 4 people in his whole career who genuinely had that. Another pause, longer. He said his daughter had it more than any of them. She kept her eyes forward. He never saw me fly, she said. No, Griffin said, he just knew. She didn't answer that. The LZ came up below. Green smoke bending hard west in the storm's leading wind, and she adjusted for the crosswind before she'd consciously finished calculating it, because the aircraft told her what it needed, and she gave it what it needed, and that she understood now. Finally, all the way down was the whole of what her father had been trying to explain. In every story, every lesson passed sideways through Walt Greer for 8 years without either of them saying the real name of what was being handed down. She put it down for the 8th time. Smooth, like setting down a cup. Odette's contact called back in 18 minutes, not 20, which told her something about how urgently the information had been waiting to be found. She listened, asked 3 questions, thanked the voice on the other end, and ended the call, and then stood against a sandbag wall for a full 60 seconds, looking at nothing, letting what she'd just learned settle into the shape of everything she already suspected. Then she called Whitlock back. The authorization chain on the Wren Hollow operation 4 years ago, she said. I'm listening. The original intelligence assessment showed that insertion area as actively monitored, confirmed staging activity going back 3 weeks. That assessment was modified before it reached mission planning. Modified to show the area as clear. A silence on the line. The modification traces to a flag-level authorization, Odette said, held at the time by a 1-star serving in an oversight capacity for Special Operations Intelligence. Ransom, Whitlock said. Not a question. Marcus Nash found the discrepancy, Odette said. He started pulling the thread. He told Griffin Aldraty what he'd found. And then he was sent on a mission built on intelligence that had already been changed to keep him from finishing what he'd started. More silence. When Whitlock spoke again, his voice had changed, not the voice of a man managing a crisis anymore, but the voice of someone about to decide, under time pressure, with no good options and exactly one necessary one, what kind of officer he actually was. Where's the documentation, he said. In my possession, Odette said, and in a location outside the normal chain. Good, Whitlock said, and hung up. She looked west, at the storm closer now, the light failing, going from gold to something flatter and grayer that made the mountains look 2-dimensional. And through the gray, faint, then not faint, the sound of rotors coming back fast. She flew the 8th run home, offloaded 49, and lifted again almost immediately. Because there was no time left to rest between runs anymore. The storm had stopped being a number on a forecast and become a wall she could see with her own eyes, close enough now that its edge showed in the quality of the light itself. The 9th run had 51 on the manifest. She locked in the routing on the flight management system, cross-referencing it against the paper sectional the way she'd been doing all day, building redundancy into her navigation. Because redundancy was how you survived the moments when one system failed you. She glanced at the coordinate display. Grid designation 442. She looked at her paper map, looked back at the display. 442 was 800 meters east of the landing zone she'd used all day. 800 meters east of the Triple Bend riverbed, the collapsed structure, every landmark she'd committed to memory across 9 hours of flying this exact valley. 800 meters east put her at the base of the eastern ridge, where the technical vehicles had been operating since the first run, where the RPG teams had repositioned 4 separate times, where any pilot following the system without cross-checking would fly herself and 51 people directly into the worst possible ground in this entire valley. Something cold moved through her chest. She keyed the radio, kept her voice exactly as steady as it had been all day, even though nothing behind it felt steady anymore. "Confirm your position," she said. "Landmark designators." A beat, then the voice she'd come to know without ever seeing his face. "Triple Bend at my south, collapsed structure at my west. Same as it's been all day." "Copy," she said. "What grid does that give you?" A shorter beat this time. He'd heard something in her voice. 447, he said. "Copy. Inbound to 447. Disregarding system data." Silence. Then not the coordinator's voice. A different one, directly on the primary frequency, which meant someone had been monitoring it, waiting. "Tail 47, this is General Ransom. Your navigation data has been updated per current mission intelligence. Approach 442 as directed. Acknowledge." Harlow said nothing. "Tail 47, acknowledge. The valley, the storm, the ridge with the technical vehicles. 51 people standing on a piece of ground, designated 447, by every landmark, every radio call, every scrap of information she'd accumulated across 9 hours of flying this exact location. "I hear you," she said, and turned toward 447. 47, you are deviating from directed routing. I am ordering you to..." She turned the volume down. Not off, down. Griffin looked at her. She flew. "Harlow," he said. "If you're wrong, I'm not wrong. If you're wrong, there are 51 people at 442 who..." "I have been to that valley 9 times today," she said, and something in her voice had gone very flat and very certain. The way things go when there's no more room left for doubt to live in it. "I know where 447 is. I know what 442 is." He confirmed his position 3 minutes ago. "That data came from inside the network in the last hour, and it wasn't there on my last check before run 8. She kept her eyes on the terrain. "Someone changed those coordinates while I was in transit. Someone who had access and knew I'd checked the system on final approach for the last major lift." Griffin was quiet. "I know where they are," she said. "I know because I've flown there 9 times. I know because he just confirmed it. And I know because the alternative is flying this aircraft and 51 people into a ridge with a technical vehicle and an RPG team sitting on the high ground above it." She reached into her chest pocket, found the folded note, still unopened, still warm from 12 hours of being carried against her. She couldn't open it now. Her hands were occupied and would stay occupied, but she pressed it flat against her palm on the cyclic grip, felt the paper there, felt everything it represented, pressing back into her hand. Trust the bird. She hadn't known this morning. Those were her father's words. She'd only ever known them as Walt's. "My father found something in the authorization chain for Wren Hollow 4 years ago," she said. "He was close to the end of it, and then he was sent on a mission built on intelligence that had already been changed." She paused. One breath. "And now someone just changed my coordinates on the last run of the day." She looked forward. "I am not going to 442. Griffin looked at the terrain ahead. "Override the system," he said. "Go to manual nav, already doing it." "Call your turns," he said. "Left to 255, 4 miles. Left 255, she confirmed. The display locked out. Manual navigation, terrain memory, and one very good paper map. Ransom's voice came back, louder now, insistent in a way that felt, somehow, less frightening than the quiet version had been. Because loud people were people who'd already lost whatever initiative they'd started with. She turned the radio off. She thought about her father, not the photograph. The version she'd been assembling all day, out of Griffin's stories, out of Ezra's, out of every scrap of him that had surfaced in the last 9 hours. She thought about a man who'd found something dangerous and written his daughter a note and trusted a friend to carry it for 4 years, believing the way you believe something only when you've decided to believe it regardless of outcome, that it would eventually reach her, that she'd be here, that she'd know what to do. 1 mile, Griffin said. Copy. Green smoke rose from below. The triple bend, the collapsed structure, everything exactly where it had been all day, exactly where the voice on the radio had told her it was. Tail 47 is inbound, she said. Open frequency for anyone listening. 447. Immediate copy. A voice came back instantly. 47 LZ is cold, winds 270 at 12. You are clear to land. She descended into the valley for the 9th time. The last major lift. She brought it down the way she'd brought it down every time before. No drama, no performance. A steady rate, the collective easing off smoothly as the ground rose to meet her, the cyclic making the small constant corrections that kept the aircraft exactly where it needed to be. The skids touched rock and dust. The cargo door opened before weight had fully settled onto the gear, and 51 people moved through it, fast wounded first. 4 litters carried by hands that had been doing this all day and hadn't slowed down once. Then the ambulatory, following the sequence they'd established hours ago without anyone having to say it out loud anymore. She kept her hands on the controls, kept her eyes on the instruments, kept the aircraft ready. Through the windscreen, through the dust kicked up by her own rotor, the storm's edge was close enough now to change the color of the light itself. 50 aboard, Griffin said. 1 more. He came last, the way rear security always comes last. Walked backward to the door, weapon still up, covering the position until the exact second he crossed the threshold, and then the door slid shut behind him, and she didn't need anyone to tell her he was aboard. She lifted. The valley fell away below her, for the final time on this run. The riverbed, the collapsed structure, the boulder field at the north end, the place where over 300 people had been waiting since before dawn, and where now there was only rock and dust and a storm arriving to reclaim ground that had briefly, urgently, mattered more than almost anywhere on earth. She climbed. The storm hit the valley floor behind her while she was still passing through 2,000 feet, and she felt its edge reach up and shake the airframe once, hard, like something announcing its authority. She held through it. Maintained heading. The aircraft complained, briefly, and then settled, and she came out into clear air above the weather layer, blue and open, with 93 miles of sky between her and everything waiting back at Outpost Thorn. She set her cruise heading. Took a breath, for real one. The kind that reaches the bottom of the lungs, the kind you only take when you've been holding it without realizing, and finally have permission to stop. 51 confirmed aboard, Griffin said quietly. All personnel, 0 casualties in extraction. She nodded. Total extracted, he said. She kept her eyes forward. 380, she said. The math had worked. She had changed the math, and the math had held, and somewhere behind her sternum, next to the photograph and the letter and everything else she'd carried into this valley and back out of it 9 times, something small and exhausted and enormously proud sat very still and let itself, for one moment, simply exist. She reached into her chest pocket, found the folded paper. Could read it now. The heading was set. The aircraft was level. Griffin was watching everything that needed watching. And she was the pilot, and the pilot could finally do this. She unfolded it. Her father's handwriting. Forward-leaning. Not neat. The way people write when they have something urgent to say and aren't sure how much time is left to say it. Harlow, if you're reading this, Griffin kept his word, which doesn't surprise me, because Griffin has never broken his word in 30 years, and I don't think he's planning to start now. If you're reading this, something happened to me. I'm sorry. There's no sentence that covers that, but I'm sorry. I need to tell you something I can't put in a report. There are people in this chain who are not what they say they are. I found something. I don't have all of it yet, but I have enough to know that intelligence coming down through certain desks has been shaped by people whose interests aren't the interests of the ones flying on it. I need someone outside my chain to know this exists. Trusting Griffin to get this to you when you're ready. You're probably rolling your eyes right now, probably thinking, "Dad, you're being dramatic. That was always your word for me." Maybe. But listen, you have better instincts than I do. You always did. Walt told me that back in 17 called me and said, "Your daughter's going to be a better pilot than you ever were." And I said, "I know." And he said, "Don't let them stop her. Don't let them stop you. Trust the bird. It already knows the way home. I love you, Dad." She folded the letter, put it back against the photograph, against her chest, against everything that had brought her exactly to this altitude, on exactly this heading, carrying exactly this weight, and she flew home. The descent into Outpost Thorn looked exactly like the first 9 descents had looked. That was the strange thing about endings. They rarely announced themselves. They just arrived, disguised as one more ordinary approach, one more standard glide path, one more set of numbers ticking down on an altimeter that had no idea it was about to become the last one that mattered. Harlow watched the base rise up out of the haze below her, the same brown rectangles, the same wire perimeter, the same flight line she'd walked across that morning as a person nobody had bothered to learn the name of. Except she wasn't that person anymore, which was a strange thought to have at 400 feet with a storm chewing through the mountains behind her. Because you'd think a day like this one would change you gradually, in stages, a little more each hour. Instead, it felt like it had happened all at once, somewhere over the 9th landing zone, in the space between hearing a general's voice order her into an ambush and choosing, calmly, without permission from anyone, to fly somewhere else instead. She checked her instruments one final time. Everything green. She brought tail 47 down onto the center line. Not left, not right. The exact painted stripe she'd looked at that morning, back when there were unconscious pilots on the pavement and the world hadn't yet required her to become whoever she'd just spent 9 hours becoming. The skids touched. She pulled the throttles back to ground idle, and in the quiet that followed the real quiet, the kind that only exists once the rotors have finally stopped turning, she sat very still. She didn't move. Griffin ran the shutdown checklist beside her, left hand steady on every switch, page by page, item by item, his right arm still resting useless in his lap. He did his job. He let her have the moment, which was exactly right, because some moments don't belong to anyone else, no matter how many people were technically present for them. The rotor blades slowed, stopped. Silence. The genuine kind. The kind that only exists when rotors aren't turning, and everyone around you understands without being told that you need 3 seconds before the world is allowed back in. The ground crew arrived first, then the medical teams, moving fast toward the cargo door for the last of the wounded. The whole choreography she'd watched assemble itself across 10 runs, now finishing its final performance without her needing to think about a single part of it. And then crossing the flight line alone, no radio, no staff, no entourage. Colonel Vance Whitlock. He walked to the pilot's door, stopped outside it, looked at her through the glass. She looked back at him the way she'd looked at him that morning, when he'd told her to get out of his command post. Same face, same eyes, except everything behind them had changed. He said nothing. Then he raised his right hand. A full salute. Held it 3 full seconds. She hadn't expected that. She didn't entirely know what to do with it, so she did the only thing that felt right. Took one hand off the collective and returned it. Crisp, the way you return something you've been given. Without knowing you'd earned it. He lowered his hand, turned, walked away. That was enough. Exactly enough. Torrin Blake came to the cockpit last, stood at her window. She looked at him, and this time finally he spoke. "How many hours?" he said through the glass. "Today," she said. "About 9.5, almost." Something moved across his face. "Total?" 1,409, she said, "as of right now." He looked at her a moment. 1,409 hours, he said slowly, and none of them were on anyone's record this morning. "No," she said. "They weren't." He shook his head. "Once. The way you shake your head when you've run into something you don't have the right words for, and you've decided the head shake is going to have to be the whole response. They're on the record now," he said, and walked away. She watched him go. Then she opened the pilot's door, climbed down onto the flight line of Outpost Thorn. The ground was solid under her boots, which was the correct way for ground to be, which she noticed specifically the way you notice things you've been away from long enough to have started missing without realizing it. Odette Bonneau was waiting at the edge of the flight line. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, and Harlow walked to her, and Odette put a hand on her shoulder. Not a hug, not a ceremony. Just, "I'm here, and I see you, and you did it." Harlow put her hand into her chest pocket, felt the note, the photograph. Both of them, still there, still warm from a whole day of being carried against her heart, like something that might otherwise get lost. "He found it," she said. 4 years ago. Found it, and wrote me a note, and trusted Griffin to carry it until I was ready." "Yes," Odette said, "and then he was sent in anyway." "Yes." A pause. "And there's more to it than the letter says, more than you know yet." Harlow looked at her. "Ransom," Harlow said. Not a question, a name that had been sitting in her chest since the moment his voice came through her radio ordering her toward a grid square that would have gotten 51 people killed. "I know some of it," Odette said. "Not all. There's someone who's been carrying a piece of this for 4 years, and I think you need to hear it from him, not from me." She paused. "He's in the aid station. He asked that I let him tell you himself." Harlow's stomach tightened around something she didn't have a name for yet. "Who?" she said. "Ezra Holloway," Odette said. "The man from your 5th run. The one with the chest wound." The aid station smelled like antiseptic and the particular exhaustion of a building that had more emergencies in one day than most bases saw in a month. Harlow found him propped up on a cot near the back, an IV line still taped into his forearm, color returning slowly to a face that had been gray 4 hours earlier. He was not supposed to be sitting up. She could tell that from the way the nurse hovering nearby kept glancing at him, like she was one bad decision away from strapping him down. He looked at her when she came through the door. Something in his face rearranged itself. Not surprise exactly. More like relief finally allowed to surface after being held underwater for a very long time. "You're the pilot," he said. "I'm the pilot," she agreed. "You're the one who bled all over my cabin." A small, exhausted laugh escaped him, and it seemed to cost him something, a wince right after it, his hand going briefly to his side. "Sorry about that," he said. "Wasn't really planned, I noticed." She sat on the empty cot across from him, the way Griffin had described someone else sitting once, in a different aid station, 4 years ago and half a world removed. "Odette said you wanted to tell me something." He was quiet for a moment, studying her the way you study something you've been carrying an image of for so long that the real version feels almost like a betrayal of the version in your head, except in this case it wasn't a betrayal. It was better. It was so much better it took him a second to speak past it. "I was there," he said. 4 years ago, the mission that killed your father." Harlow went very still. "I wasn't aviation," he said. "Ground element. I was in the back of his aircraft in the dark, on the insertion flight, and he talked the whole way in." He looked at her. "About you." "Don't cry," she told herself. "Not here. Not yet, later. There's a schedule for this. You already decided there was a schedule." "What did he say?" she managed. "That you had better instincts than he did." Ezra's voice was steady, careful, like he was handling something breakable and knew it. "That he'd made sure of it. That you'd end up here eventually, doing exactly what you did today, whether anyone gave you permission or not." She pressed her palm flat against her chest pocket, against the shapes of the photograph and the letter underneath her uniform. He knew, Ezra said, before the mission. He knew something was wrong with the intelligence. He told me that, too, in the dark on the way in. Said he'd found a thread and hadn't gotten to the end of it. Said if anything happened, someone needed to make sure it got to you eventually. He paused. I've been carrying something of his for 4 years. Trying to find you. It took longer than it should have. I don't have a good excuse for that. I just have an apology. He reached into a gear bag beside the cot, the same one the medics had cut his plate carrier out of hours earlier, and pulled out something small. Metal. Stamped alloy. He held it out to her. She took it. It was cold in a way the letter never had been. Cold from being separated from a body's warmth for 4 years, instead of carried against one. And the coldness of it hit her harder than she expected, because it meant something. It meant this object had been sitting somewhere, waiting. The entire time she'd been growing up without her father, the entire time she'd been learning to fly in a field in Montana, the entire time she'd been memorizing his handwriting off the back of a single photograph, because there wasn't enough of it to memorize anywhere else. A flight badge, a crest, a name along the lower edge. Nash, I found it in the wreckage, Ezra said quietly, 6 feet from where he fell, intact. I don't know how. I've stopped trying to explain it. She turned it over in her palm, felt the weight of it settle there, small, heavy in the way things are heavy when they carry more than their actual mass. Thank you, she said, and her voice cracked slightly on the second word, and she let it crack, because some things were allowed to crack, and this was one of them. There's more, Ezra said. Not today. You've had enough today. But there's more, and when you're ready, I want to tell you the rest. She nodded, closed her fingers around the badge. Today, she said, this is enough. She didn't sleep that night. Not really. She lay on her cot in the shared quarters, staring at a ceiling she'd stared at for 6 weeks without ever really seeing it, and replayed the day in fragments that refused to arrange themselves in order. The flicker of the fluorescent light in Hangar 4, the smoke trail of an RPG crossing the windscreen, Griffin's voice saying he was right about you, the cold weight of a badge in her palm. Because that was the thing about days like this one. They didn't end when the aircraft landed. They kept going, quietly, inside you, long after everyone else had gone back to their normal lives, and their normal sleep schedules and their normal understanding of what an ordinary Tuesday was supposed to feel like. Somewhere around 300 the same hour she'd been kneeling, in that hangar the morning before, the same hour that had started all of this, she gave up on sleep entirely and sat up, and pulled the letter out of her chest pocket, and read it again. Not because she'd forgotten what it said, because she needed to hear it in her own head, one more time, in her father's handwriting, in a voice she'd constructed so carefully over 4 years that it had started to feel almost as real as a memory. Trust the bird. It already knows the way home. She folded it back up, put it beside the badge on the small shelf above her cot, and somewhere in the dark, without deciding to, she started crying, not the loud kind, not the kind that needed witnesses, just the quiet kind that had apparently been waiting all day for permission to happen. And now that the day was over, it took its permission and used it. She let it. The investigation moved faster than anyone expected, which Odette told her later. When there was finally time to sit and talk properly, was itself a small miracle, because investigations involving general officers rarely moved fast, unless someone very senior had already decided which direction they wanted it to move. The fuel analysis, the access logs, Ezra's thumb drive, which had gone, exactly as he'd insisted, outside the normal chain of command, first to a contact in the Inspector General's office, then to a Senate staffer who'd apparently been running her own quiet inquiry into the Wren Hollow authorization chain for almost 2 years without anyone at the operational level ever knowing, which meant that by the time General Miles Ransom's name surfaced in connection with a modified intelligence assessment from 4 years earlier, there were already 2 independent threads pulling toward the same conclusion, and neither of them had originated anywhere he could reach. Harlow learned most of this second-hand in pieces, over the days that followed, because she was still processing manifests and running post-flight inspections and trying to figure out how to be an ordinary person, again, inside a body that had spent one entire day being something else. But Odette made a point of telling her the parts that mattered, sitting across from her in the mess hall over coffee that had gone cold twice because neither of them wanted to stop talking long enough to reheat it. The original assessment showed the insertion area as actively monitored, Odette said. Confirmed staging activity. 3 weeks of drone coverage. That assessment was altered before it reached mission planning. Altered to show the area clear. By Ransom, Harlow said. Not a question anymore. She'd stopped needing it to be a question days ago. The modification traces to an authorization code that was his, Odette said. At the time, he held an oversight role for Special Operations Intelligence. He had the access. He had the motive. Your father had found the discrepancy and started asking questions in rooms Ransom didn't want questions asked in. Harlow turned her coffee cup slowly on the table, not drinking it, just needing something to do with her hands. So he had my father killed, she said. Flat, because there wasn't a softer way to say it and she'd stopped looking for one. He had your father sent into a situation he knew was compromised, Odette said carefully. Whether that's the same thing, legally, is something a lot of very expensive lawyers are going to argue about for a long time. But morally, she held Harlow's eyes. Yes, it's the same thing. Harlow looked down at her hands. And today, she said, the coordinates. He tried to do it again. He tried to do it again, Odette confirmed, because you were flying your father's mission all over again 4 years later, and he made the same choice twice. Except this time it didn't work. No, Odette said, and something almost like a smile moved across her tired face. This time it didn't work at all. The formal notification came 6 days later. Harlow was in Hangar 4, the same hangar, the same bay, the same fluorescent light that had, mercifully, finally stopped flickering after someone replaced the ballast that had been dying for 6 weeks when Whitlock found her, a printed message in his hand. She stood up from the panel she'd been working on, wiped her hands on a rag. General Ransom has been relieved of duty, Whitlock said, without preamble, because he'd apparently decided somewhere along the way that she'd earned the version of him that didn't waste time on softening things. Pending formal review by the Inspector General and a joint inquiry with the Senate Committee. There will be a court-martial. It will take time. These things always take time. Harlow nodded slowly. Devlin, Whitlock added the logistics specialist, the one whose access logs had lit up the fuel analysis like a flare, was arrested at the motor pool the same afternoon you landed. He's cooperating. Says he was following orders he believed came from legitimate channels. Might even be telling the truth. Doesn't change what he did. And my father's case, Harlow said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. Wren Hollow, 4 years ago. Whitlock's jaw tightened, the same small muscle movement she'd watched that morning when he'd been deciding whether to send her into a valley or refuse. Reopened, he said. Formally. As of yesterday. He held her eyes. Your father's death is going to be reclassified. Not enemy contact. Not simple. The record's going to show what actually happened, that he was sent into a position known to be compromised by intelligence deliberately but altered to conceal that fact. Something in Harlow's chest, something that had been clenched tight for 4 years, without her fully realizing how tight, loosened by one small, significant degree. It won't bring him back, Whitlock said, quieter now. I know that's not enough. I know it was never going to be enough. But it's true, and for 4 years the truth wasn't available to you. Now it is. Harlow looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. Turned to leave. Stopped in the hangar doorway. Nash, he said, not turning around. Your contractor rotation ends in 2 weeks. I know. There's a recommendation letter on my desk with your name on it, he said, for the Academy's rotary wing commissioning track. I'd have signed it before today if I'm honest. After today, I'd have signed it in blood. He walked out before she could answer, which she suspected was deliberate, the kind of thing a man says and then leaves quickly, because staying to watch the reaction would have made it about him instead of her. She stood alone in the hangar for a long moment. The fluorescent light finally, steadily, holding its light without flickering, and let that particular kind of quiet settle over her the way it had settled. After the rotors stopped turning 6 days earlier, she flew home 3 weeks later. Not in a Black Hawk, in a commercial jet, coach class, a window seat she'd requested specifically so she could watch the ground the whole way. Old habits, apparently, didn't unlearn themselves just because the aircraft changed. Somewhere over the Midwest, the pilot came on the intercom to announce their descent into a regional airport 2 hours from where her mother lived, and Harlow found herself, without deciding to, listening to the tone of his voice the way she now listened to every pilot's voice, checking, automatically, for the small signs of strain that meant something was wrong before the instruments would show it. There was no strain. It was an ordinary landing. A completely ordinary landing on an ordinary runway, in an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, in a country that had no idea what had happened in a valley on the other side of the world 3 weeks earlier. Which was, she thought, exactly how it should be. That was the whole point of what she'd done, so that ordinary Tuesdays could keep existing for the people who deserved them. The house was the same. That was the thing about coming home. The world had moved enormously. In rooms in Washington, and oversight offices, and quiet administrative processes that were only beginning, slowly, to grind towards something that might eventually resemble accountability. And the kitchen was exactly the same. Yellow curtains, the old coffee pot, a ceramic mug with a chipped handle her mother had been threatening to replace since in sometime around 2019, and would probably keep for the rest of her life anyway, out of stubbornness or sentiment, which in her mother's case had always been indistinguishable from each other. Her mother set a cup of coffee in front of her, sat down across the table, and didn't ask anything. That was the gift. The specific gift of a woman who'd spent 14 years married to a man who couldn't always talk about where he'd been, and then 4 years without him, and who had earned, but across all of it, the particular grace of sitting with someone who wasn't ready to talk and not making that harder than it already was. They sat. They drank coffee. Outside the window, a tree Harlow had climbed as a child moved gently in the afternoon breeze, and for a while, neither of them said anything at all, and that silence was, somehow, exactly the right amount of full. The knock came at 8:43 in the morning. 3 days later, Harlow looked at her mother. Her mother looked at the door. She opened it. Ezra Holloway stood on the porch, taller than Harlow had registered in the aid station, where she'd only known him as a set of vital signs and a weight distribution problem in Odette's careful hands. Civilian clothes now. A jacket that hung slightly loose on a frame that had clearly lost weight it hadn't had to spare. The specific look of someone recently out of a hospital bed and not entirely back to being himself yet. I found this at Wren Hollow, he said, though he wasn't holding anything visible, and for a half second, Harlow's stomach dropped, thinking he meant more news, more weight, more of the day she still hadn't finished carrying. Then he reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out something small, metal, stamped alloy, a crest. She already had it. He'd given it to her in the aid station, except this was different, smaller. A second badge, older, more worn, the enamel chipped on one edge from what looked like decades of handling. This one was your father's from earlier in his career, Ezra said, before the unit reassignment. I found it going through some records at the request of the Inspector General's office. Thought you should have both. She took it, cold, like the first one had been. But this time the cold didn't hit her the same way. This time it felt more like completion than absence. I should have found you sooner, Ezra said. I don't have a good reason why I didn't. I've been telling myself for 4 years that I would, eventually, when the timing was right, and there's never actually a right time for something like this. I'm sorry it took this long. She looked at the badge in her hand, then at him. You found it, she said. That's what matters. I was there, Ezra said quietly. At the end, and I need you to know what you were told. The official version. It wasn't the whole truth, and it wasn't his fault. He knew something was wrong with that mission before he ever got in the aircraft. He went anyway, because his crew was going, and he wasn't going to let them go without him. He paused, steadying himself against something Harlow couldn't quite see. That's who he was. She kept looking at the badge, turning it slowly between her fingers, and she thought, distantly, that she didn't have words shaped correctly for this moment, so she didn't reach for any. "Come in," she said instead. "My mom just made coffee." He stepped inside. Her mother looked at him, looked at Harlow, looked at the badge in Harlow's hand, and something crossed her face. Recognition, maybe, or the particular ache of a woman meeting, for the first time, someone who'd been present for the worst thing that had ever happened to her family. She didn't ask. She went to the cabinet and took down a third mug. They sat at the table, all three of them, in the yellow-curtained morning of a Kansas kitchen that had absolutely no business holding a story this large, and yet somehow held it anyway. Ezra told them what he knew. Not all of it at once. Some of it came out in order. Some of it came sideways, doubling back on itself, stopping and starting again. Because there are things that are hard to say, not because they're complicated, but because they're heavy, and you can only carry them out of yourself a small piece at a time. He told them about the flight in, 4 years earlier, about the dark cabin, the vibration of the rotors, her father's voice cutting through the noise to talk about a daughter he was certain, even then, was going to end up exactly where she'd ended up 3 weeks ago. He told them about the mission going wrong, about what wrong had actually looked like, stripped of the 3 careful paragraphs in an official letter that had misspelled her name in the second one. He told them about finding the badge in the wreckage afterward, about carrying it for 4 years, through 2 more deployments, and a medical discharge, and a re-enlistment that had taken 18 months of favors, called in from every corner of a career, all of it aimed at one single, stubborn goal: getting back to a place he had no personal desire to return to, because he had something to finish that he hadn't been able to finish any other way. When he was done, the kitchen sat quiet for a long moment, weighted with everything that had just been said out loud, for the first time in a house that had spent 4 years absorbing a version of the story that wasn't true. Her mother stood up, refilled all 3 cups without asking, sat back down. That, too, was its own kind of statement. Later, after Ezra had gone, after he'd promised to stay in touch, after Harlow's mother had hugged him at the door with the particular fierce gratitude of someone thanking a stranger for finishing something her husband had started and never gotten to complete, Harlow's mother sat back down across the table. He used to say, her mother said, looking into her coffee cup instead of at Harlow, the way people look somewhere else when they're saying something they haven't said out loud in a long time, that the aircraft knew more than the pilot, that your job wasn't to be smarter than it. Your job was to be honest enough to listen. She smiled. Small. The particular smile she kept in reserve for things she hadn't allowed herself to say in years. He said, "Trust the bird. It already knows the way home." Harlow looked up. "He said that about everything eventually," her mother said. "Not just flying." Harlow looked down at the 2 badges in her palm, the newer one, cold and clean, and the older one, worn soft at the edges from a lifetime of handling before she'd even been born. She thought about the canyon route, the brownout, the coordinates that had read 442 while every landmark in the valley had insisted correctly on 447. She thought about the moment she'd turned the radio volume down instead of off, choosing to keep listening even while refusing to obey. She thought about what it felt like to know something without being fully able to explain how she knew it, and to act on that knowing anyway, and to be right. She understood now, sitting in her mother's kitchen with 2 flight badges, warming slowly in her palm, what her father had actually been trying to teach her in every summer lesson relayed sideways through a family friend in Montana, in every story her mother had never quite finished telling, in a single folded letter carried for 4 years by a man who kept his promises, even when keeping them cost him almost everything. It wasn't about the aircraft. It had never really been about the aircraft. It was about learning to trust something in yourself that operates below the level of instruction, the thing in your hands, in your instincts, in the part of you that knows the right coordinates, even when someone with more rank and less honesty is telling you otherwise. Her father had spent his whole short life quietly building that instinct into her, one lesson, one story, one carefully worded piece of advice at a time, preparing her. She understood now. For a morning he had no way of knowing was coming, and yet had somehow prepared for anyway, as if some part of him had always known she'd need it eventually. She closed her fingers around both badges, held them. The good kind of weight, the kind that belongs to you, the kind you've been ready to carry longer than you knew. The court-martial took 11 months. Harlow followed most of it from a distance, through updates Odette sent when there was something worth sending, through occasional calls from Ezra, checking in on her, the way you check in on someone you'd fought alongside, even if the fighting had looked different for each of you. She testified once, over a secure video link, about the coordinates, about the radio call, about the exact sequence of decisions that had put 51 people on the ground at 447 instead of the ambush, waiting at 442. She kept her answers short. Factual. The way you'd fly an instrument approach, trust the numbers, don't editorialize, let the data speak for itself. Miles Ransom was convicted on charges that took a military legal team most of a page to fully articulate: dereliction of duty, conspiracy, obstruction. The word murder never technically appeared in the official language, because the law, apparently, had very specific and very frustrating requirement about intent, direct causation, that a modified intelligence assessment that satisfied only partially in the eyes of people whose job it was to satisfy such requirements precisely. But Marcus Nash's file was reclassified, officially, permanently, not enemy contact, line of duty death resulting from deliberately compromised mission intelligence. It wasn't the word Harlow had wanted. There was no word that would have been the word she wanted, because the word she actually wanted didn't exist in any official vocabulary. The word for my father should still be alive, and he isn't, and nothing in any court record is ever going to change that. But it was true, and for 4 years, the truth hadn't been available to her family. Now it was. She started flight right training at the academy the following spring. Her 1,409 civilian hours, finally, officially, on the record where they should have been all along, waved her through the early foundational courses that would have taken most cadets an entire semester to complete. Instructors who'd flown with her father decades earlier, in some cases, found reasons to stop by the flight line during her training blocks, just to watch, just to see for themselves whether the stories about Marcus Nash's daughter were the kind of thing that got exaggerated in the retelling, or the kind of thing that was, if anything, undersold. They were undersold. She flew the way she'd flown over Wren Hollow, not fighting the aircraft, not performing for anyone watching, just listening to what it was telling her, and giving it what it needed, the way her father had apparently spent his whole too short life quietly teaching her to do, one lesson passed sideways at a time, until the lesson had become so completely part of her that she no longer needed to think about where it had come from. She kept both badges on a small shelf in her dorm room, the photograph beside them. The letter, its creases now worn soft from a full year of being read and reread, folded carefully into a drawer, she opened whenever the day had been hard enough to need it, and closed again once it had done what it needed to do. Griffin Aldrate retired from active flying 8 months after Wren Hollow. His right arm never fully recovered its fine motor control, a permanent souvenir of a poisoning he'd survived but never entirely walked away from. He took a position instructing at the academy instead, and made it his particular business, without ever announcing it as a mission, to be present for as many of Harlow's flight evaluations as his schedule allowed. "You don't have to keep showing up," she told him once, after a particularly grueling instrument check ride, both of them standing on the tarmac in the fading afternoon light. "I know," Griffin said. "I do it anyway." She smiled at that, the echo of something he'd said to her once before, in a different cockpit, under considerably worse circumstances, and he smiled back, because he remembered saying it too, and some sentences, apparently, were worth repeating more than once in a life. Odette Bonneau stayed in touch the way people stay in touch when a shared crisis has quietly reorganized itself into something closer to family. She sent a card on the anniversary of the extraction every year with nothing more inside it than a single line, 380. Still counting. Harlow kept every one of them. Ezra Holloway visited Kansas twice more over the following 2 years, once for a small private, where Marcus Nash's reclassified service record was formally read into the family's possession, the official government language finally matching the truth. Harlow's family had been waiting 4 years to hear spoken out loud, and once, quietly, without any occasion at all, just to sit in the same kitchen, drink the same coffee, and confirm for himself as much as for them that the promise he'd made 4 years ago in a country far from here had finally, fully, been kept. "You did it," Harlow told him, the second visit, as he was getting ready to leave. "You found me. Took longer than either of us wanted, but you did it." "I had help," Ezra said, glancing toward the kitchen window, toward a Kansas sky that had absolutely nothing to do with the valley where they'd first met, and yet somehow felt connected to it anyway, the way all sky eventually does. "Your father." "Mostly. He set the whole thing in motion long before I ever showed up." "He usually did," Harlow said, and meant it, and for the first time, in longer than she could easily remember, saying something like that out loud didn't hurt nearly as much as it once had. 3 years after Wren Hollow, Harlow Nash was commissioned as a rotary wing aviator, the youngest in her graduating cohort to be immediately assigned to an operational squadron rather than a training billet. A decision the review board justified, in careful official language, by citing demonstrated operational competence exceeding standard commissioning benchmarks, which was a bureaucratic way of saying what everyone in that room already knew. Her mother flew out for the ceremony, sat in the front row, cried in the specific, quiet way she'd been crying at important moments for 4 years now, not loudly, not for show, just a steady, private overflow that she made no particular effort to hide anymore. Afterward, in the reception line, a young cadet 19, maybe 20, the kind of nervous energy that hadn't yet been worn down by anything real, approached Harlow with a question she'd apparently been building up the courage to ask all afternoon. "Is it true," the cadet said, "that you flew 9 extractions in one day, before you were even commissioned?" Harlow considered the question, considered all the ways she could answer it, the technical version, the modest version, the version that would satisfy a review board's careful language about demonstrated competence. "I flew what needed flying," she said instead. "That's really all it ever is. You find out what needs flying, and you fly it, and you let the aircraft tell you the rest." The cadet looked slightly unsatisfied with that answer, the way young people often are when the truth turns out to be simpler than the myth they were hoping for. Harlow understood. She'd have felt the same way once. But some things she'd learned only became fully true once you'd lived them yourself. You couldn't hand someone else the whole of it in a single sentence at a graduation reception. You could only hand them the beginning of it, and trust that, if it was theirs to learn, they'd find their own way to the rest. That night, alone in her new quarters on base, Harlow took both badges down from the shelf, where they'd traveled with her through every posting since Wren Hollow, set them side by side on the small table beside her bed. The newer one, the older one, her father's handwriting on the letter beside them, worn soft now from 3 years of reading. She thought about the fluorescent light in Hangar 4 that had flickered every 40 seconds for 6 days before she finally found the fault no one else had thought to look for, about a room full of officers who'd looked at her like she was standing on the wrong side of a door, about a valley that had taken something from her family once, and had almost taken more, and hadn't managed either time because she'd refused to let it. She thought about her father, the version she'd built, piece by piece, out of a photograph and a letter, and the careful testimony of men who'd known him in ways she never got the chance to. A man who'd spent his whole short life quietly preparing his daughter for a morning he had no way of knowing was coming, trusting, the way you trust something only when you've decided to trust it regardless of outcome, that when the moment finally arrived, she'd know exactly what to do. She had. Outside her window, the base sat quiet under a wide, dark, ordinary sky, the kind of sky that had nothing urgent happening beneath it tonight. No wounded waiting, no storm closing in, no ambush hidden behind a false set of coordinates. Just sky doing what sky does, indifferent and enormous and entirely, blessedly, unremarkable. She reached over, turned off the light, and somewhere in the quiet, in the particular dark of a room that finally, after everything, felt completely like her own, she heard it not out loud, never out loud, but clear all the same, the way certain sentences become permanent once someone loves you enough to make sure they reach you, no matter how long it takes, no matter how far they have to travel. Trust the bird. It already knows the way home. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, she believed completely, without reservation, without the small frantic voice in the back of her mind arguing otherwise, that she was already there.